Out of the Second World War came an idea that the best in art and culture should be not just a luxury, but part of the reconstruction of Britain.
All over the cultural map there was the feeling that more human beings than ever before should be given access to what was best in art, science, philosophy if possible.
These years produced organisations like the Edinburgh Festival, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and the Arts Council.
A whole new structure of cultural life was created, and these things still exist today. So it was an enormously decisive moment in British cultural life.
In 1946, the BBC launched the Third Programme, a radio station devoted to high culture.
The Third Programme crystallised these very complicated and diverse social, philosophical, and let's never forget, political hopes and aims.
Whilst the Third Programme spoke to the post-war egalitarian spirit, its tone was unashamedly highbrow.
The Third Programme, in retrospect, has often been called elitist, and that's exactly what it was. Precisely the best for those who wanted the best.
That was the idea, that if it appealed to 2 people instead of 2 million, that it was worth doing.
This is the story of a brief moment when the idea of elite culture for all didn't sound like a contradiction. But it didn't last. Within 10 years, profound changes in society had broken the consensus and altered forever attitudes towards high culture in Britain. The Third Programme began broadcasting on the 29th of September 1946, with a surprisingly tongue-in-cheek feature on how to listen.
This is the BBC Third Programme, How to Listen, including how not to, how you ought to, and how you won't.
How? How? How?
Are they ready? Are they listening? Here, the house is empty. There, the set is switched off, but here, license number 865432, Mrs. Moss. Is she listening?
Turn up the wireless, Mrs. Moss. Yes, dear, it is chilly tonight. Let's turn the wireless up a bit. That's right, that's right.
Beneath the comic tone of the script by writer and humorist Stephen Potter lay a crucial message. The Third was not background listening.
The programme on the first night, done by Joyce Grenfell and Stephen Potter, How to Listen, was in a sense a new kind of programme. It was light, and there was a light element in the Third Programme, a lighter element than the very serious talks.
I can't bear it. He's found him. I can't believe it. Here he is at last. The perfect listener. The perfect listener. Somebody really listening. What shall we give him? The whole of Shakespeare. The whole of Beethoven. Now,
one essential thing that people forget about the Third Programme is that it only ever broadcast in the evenings. And that was a fundamentally different sort of radio broadcasting from the Radio 3 of today or the Radio 3 of 10 years ago. Each evening could be constructed as a work of art in its own right, and people were expected to attend to the Third Programme with the sort of concentrated fervour that they would give to going to the theatre or going to the cinema or going to a concert. It wasn't something that you just casually had on in the background.
I remember having an evening party, a cheese party, and this meant everybody brought their cheese ration, to hear from Venice the premiere of Stravinsky's Rake's Progress, with a text by Auden being explained and commented on, and one suddenly had the feeling that one was very rich, very elegant, very sophisticated, and it blew open a whole world in what was still a materially very constricted and very dour time.
The Third Programme set itself up as an enormous idealistic experiment in making the best of culture available to everybody. And that was culture, not just music.
For the opening night, the third programme commissioned Festival Overture from Benjamin Britten, and the first week included Jean-Paul Sartre's Huis Clos and George Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman.
It was just a wonderful idea that you should simply put on the best of whatever it happened to be. It was a very enlightened notion, and never mind if not a great many people were listening. That wasn't the issue at all.
In fact, in the early years, the third programme was claiming up to 2.5 million listeners. Its high-minded approach was in tune with the times. The Labour government of 1945 saw the arts as part of post-war reconstruction, and Prime Minister Clement Attlee spoke of culture's power to unify.
During the last 2 decades, especially during recent years, the heritage of culture, which was so long the possession of the few, has been more widely available to the masses of the people. The spiritual as well as the material resources of the Western nations have been more equitably shared. And had this not been so, we should have not had that unity in the struggle against totalitarianism.
This new faith in culture had its roots in the wartime experience. During the dark days of the Blitz, artistic activity in Britain had virtually ceased. Soon the government saw that culture would be needed in the war effort.
Like just about everybody in wartime, the arts and culture were conscripted. Even pacifists like Benjamin Britten found that they were actually needed for the war effort because, in a sense, even as early as 1940, people realized that culture was one of the things that the British were fighting for.
What do you think of this one?
It's not too bad, but what's the point in all this here art? Pretty pictures don't win anything. Not now, anyway.
We all know what we're fighting against. But don't you think we sometimes forget what we're fighting for?
Not pretty pictures.
Yes, but they're part of it. We've got to fight, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be free. Free to work, to play, to listen, to look at what we want to.
And it was decided that it was necessary to fund the arts, basically. The first time ever that public patronage had been set up on such an official scale. So in 1940, a group of people were brought together and they became known as the Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts.
SEMA, which supplied an enormous amount of art and employed artists during the war, really gave rise to the whole idea that public subsidy of the arts was a good idea, and that through a really well thought out system of encouraging and supporting artistic institutions, you could actually make the best of everything available to everyone. And that's really the idealistic spirit that underpins artistic life in the late 40s.
It was John Maynard Keynes, the economist behind the welfare state, who took charge of SEMA in 1942.
Keynes's vision came out of his own experience of doing things like setting up the Cambridge Arts Theatre in Cambridge and being married to a ballerina. And his was a Bloomsbury set of values which certainly regarded the high arts as his responsibility.
One of the last acts of the wartime coalition government was to give SEMA a peacetime role as the Arts Council of Great Britain.
In 1945, at the end of the war, the consensus was that culture mattered. Culture had been successfully preserved for 5 years. During the war, there'd been a fantastic appetite for culture. I think at no time in British history did people actually need culture. They needed it like they needed religion at that time. They needed it as a spiritual resource. So the feeling was, this must continue.
Public demand for culture was high. In 1945, publisher Alan Lane launched Penguin Classics with Homer's Odyssey. It became a bestseller.
The Odyssey was the first of our classics. If we'd known then what we know now, we'd have been perfectly safe in printing 100,000 or even 250,000.
Alan Lane was not an intellectual. Anything that makes him seem like a highbrow trying to educate the country is wrong. But he did, he rode a kind of dream of his own, that books matter and that more people should have them.
I was swept off my feet by the fact that in the train between Oxford and London, often freezing, often late, everyone was reading.
This was the new world that produced the third programme. The BBC's Director General, William Haley, was convinced that the station had a key cultural role to play.
Sir William Haley had a sense of mission for the BBC. He thought that it could do an immense amount to improve the cultural standards of the nation. And he thought the BBC, through the third programme, which was the top of his priorities, could really achieve more than any other institution.
But while the Light programme might well play the waltzes from Der Rosenkavalier, and the Home Service do a live broadcast of an act from Covent Garden, the third programme would devote an evening to the whole opera. The differences will be in approach, in treatment, and in emphasis.
The third programme wasn't there to make difficult material more accessible, but simply to make it available.
Haley believed in education, but he didn't want the programme to be there to teach people how to improve their taste. It was there to make them improve their taste through listening. It sounds, of course, now very elitist, and indeed it was. It was deliberately based upon the conception of elite, as was the conception of culture held by other people, particularly T.S. Eliot, to whom Haley always listened very attentively.
The poet and critic T.S. Eliot held influential views on art and society. Believing high culture should remain the preserve of a closed elite, he saw the third programme as a bastion against cultural decline.
He imagined culture, like most people did in those days, in the shape of a pyramid, with the high arts, and probably T.S. Eliot right at the top, and the low arts of folk music and dance music and so on right at the bottom. While respecting the fact that the British were now committed to supporting the high arts, at the same time, I think he was very suspicious that these values would be diluted if they were spread too wide.
Such fears gave the third programme its flavour, its rarefied air, its refusal to popularise. This approach even found support on the left, where Eliot's belief in a hierarchy of culture was shared. Elite culture, it was thought, could improve and educate all classes.
The very definition of radicalism is to have the best, to have it for more people. The radical emancipation of the humbled and the underprivileged lies also on the road to culture. I think the right was astonished, sometimes certainly negative, particularly in the question of opening privileged institutions such as certain schools and universities to a much larger field. But at that time, there was an amazing, I think, amount of consensus. Even in the open political divisions, a great deal of underlying consensus and a great deal, I can only put it this way, of that we've got to help hope along.
The third programme drew support from this consensus. As a haven for elite values and a vehicle for self-improvement, it was beyond reproach.
We, intellectuals in the provinces, we relied on it. It was almost a lifesaver. The third programme was a great gate, there's no question about it. We were up in the North Yorkshire, near Middlesbrough, and we just were third programmers.
Alan Sillitoe was another working-class writer for whom the third programme proved a lifesaver. In 1948, just returned from fighting in Malaya, he had been diagnosed with tuberculosis.
I remember going in one very gloomy November night, being wheeled in, put into bed, and listening to the chaps around me who were saying, "Oh yes, tonight there's Schubert's Unfinished on a third programme." And I thought, oh well, maybe I'll listen to it. We asked ourselves, why was it called the Unfinished? You know, what was unfinished about it, and why didn't he finish it, and so on. So we had a discussion. It very much ameliorated my attitude, my condition, and I began to feel less gloomy, more optimistic, more positive, because I had this thing to help me, in a sense, with its music.
Music was crucial to the third programme's success. The station expanded a once limited repertoire.
We'll go ahead with the second movement in 5 seconds from now.
It's not enough for the better known and more popular works of the great masters to be broadcast with varying degrees of regularity. There are many great works which escape public performance for long stretches of time. The BBC can ensure that this doesn't happen.
The third programme revived interest in early music, played all of Wagner's Ring Cycle over 4 nights, broadcast premieres of the most modern music from Bartók to Schoenberg, and showcased British composers, from Tippett to Walton.
And you cannot dissociate the explosion of genius in British music. Suddenly, all over the map, British music becomes what we now know it to be, and not only Britain and Tippett, but many others, through broadcasts.
This wave of creativity also brought new life to public performances.
Towards the end of the decade, you begin to get the idea of the festival as an annual event emerging. You get the Cheltenham Festival of Literature, you get the Aldeburgh Festival set up by Benjamin Britten, who is really riding on a high as a result of his national and international reputation.
The festival stems from Aldeburgh itself and is organised by the local people. The local hall is converted into a theatre where operas are performed, with settings by such artists as John Piper and Osbert Lancaster.
And crucially, in 1947, you get the International Festival in Edinburgh. Now, again, the important thing about the Edinburgh Festival was the international in the title, because this, again, was part of the idea of post-war reconciliation. So it was very important that German artists, German musicians and so on came to Edinburgh.
The Edinburgh International Festival was to be a version of the famous Salzburg Festival. It was intended to broaden the horizons of the British and improve international relations. Ideals also behind the third programme.
You've already heard or read, possibly too often, how it will broadcast concerts, operas, plays and other works of art in full, and how it will be also experimental and strongly international. Charles Munch, Nikolai Malko, Elisabeth Schumann, Szigeti are all coming.
During the war, German culture had been excised from the airwaves. Now, from Wagner to Brecht, the third programme was bringing it back.
Between 1945 and 1950, there was a revival of interest in Germany, and the third programme actually devoted itself so much to Goethe that there were 1 or 2 people who felt that they never wanted to read a line of Goethe.
The third programme also brought new voices to the public.
A mass medium, which radio is, always has the capacity to generate household names. Someone like Isaiah Berlin, who would broadcast talks and so on, he would be able to reach an audience way beyond the seminar room or the lecture room. Dylan Thomas, the poet, actually, I think, owes a great deal, certainly to the BBC in general, but certainly to the third programme, which employed him a lot.
The policy of encouraging experiment attracted directing and acting talent.
We were given the chance to broadcast material that had never been broadcast before. Imagine the privilege of being directed by Louis MacNeice, Douglas Clevedon, Raymond Raikes, Terence Tiller. They were inspiring, and I was hungry for it.
The third programme also felt a duty to the classical canon. Leading poet C.D. Lewis was commissioned by controller Harman Griswold to make a new translation of Virgil's Aeneid.
Now wanes the 7th summer since the destruction of Troy, and still over land and water we roam, over a world of unharbouring rocks, as we steer by the stars, and around the wide seas from wave to wave, chase after that will-o'-the-wisp Italy.
My husband, C.D. Lewis, was summoned, and Harman Griswold said to him, would £1,000 be appropriate? And my husband was absolutely poleaxed because he'd never earned that much all at once in the whole of his life. And so poleaxed was he at the thought of it that he remained silent for a moment, which made Mr. Griswold think that it wasn't enough. So he upped it to 1,500.
No expense spared, the Aeneid was the centrepiece of the third programme's contribution to the biggest cultural event of the decade, the Festival of Britain. The festival hall site was nearing completion on the South Bank.
I hope that this concert hall will long endure, to give the opportunity for the finest music, the greatest singers and players to be heard, and to give pleasure and refreshment of the soul to generations of Londoners yet unborn.
The post-war Labour government had been enormously influential in setting up support for the arts, and that really culminates in the Festival of Britain in 1951, which is supposedly to mark the centenary of the Great Exhibition of 1851, but is actually about creating a new Britain.
The festival is mostly remembered for promoting modern technology and design, but it also celebrated the culmination of the Labour government's cultural project.
I know the Festival of Britain is now generally derided. At the time, for many of us, it was a tremendous occasion. It was a feeling, look, Europe has survived, which was not at all clear. And here in Britain, there was a sense of, let's have a creative good time. I can't put it any other way. The creativeness and the fun went together.
Here was modernity. Here was the fruit of the 1930s modernist movement, at last, after the ghastly nightmare of the war, at last coming true.
Henry Moore is the most important of living British sculptors. In 1950, he was commissioned by the Arts Council of Great Britain to create a piece of sculpture which was first to be shown at the Festival of Britain.
There were a lot of sculpture commissions, some of the sculpture is still there, and of course it wasn't just in London, it was also all over the country. So a whole number of arts festivals were set up. Some of these arts festivals still continue.
There was the Land Travelling Exhibition. Highly mobile, it called in at the big cities of Britain to bring the festival theme to the nation.
The irony, of course, is that by the time the Festival of Britain closed in 1951, the Labour government was out of power, and the Conservative government, one of the first things they did was to raise the site. So all we have left from the Festival of Britain is the Festival Hall on the South Bank.
The new Conservative government did not share Labour's commitment to making high art more available. Other forces, too, were undermining the consensus. Money was running short for cultural projects, and television, which in 1947 had been available only to London, was spreading fast.
The 50s was a time of huge democratisation. television showing the coronation, something that the establishment was totally against before it happened, but everybody knew it was the right thing to do. The growth of television was bringing a different form of entertainment straight into people's homes, and I think all that begins to undermine the cultural consensus.
The austerities of the war are now an unpleasant memory. There is full employment. There's this new phenomenon called the teenager who suddenly has money to spend on clothes and record players and records. And there is leisure, and there are organizations there to provide mass entertainment.
The rise of mass entertainment seemed to pose a direct threat to the cultural ideals of the 1940s.
And there are people whose values are not those of the purveyors of mass entertainment, who are absolutely horrified by this because they see that the particular pressures of scarcity and austerity, which had made high culture especially valued, are slipping away.
Ooh, I love you so. Hey, I love you so.
The painter Augustus John voiced the fears of the arts establishment.
Under the ceaseless titillation of light entertainment, journalistic gossip, the poison of commercial films, cheap pornography, and governmental paternalism, the man of the future will have lost his personal dignity and have become a kind of robot, functioning happily enough in a second-hand world. Will art flourish in these conditions? Not likely.
The new Americanized mass culture provoked concern amongst intellectuals of all political stripes.
The big cultural figures were absolutely convinced that their culture was the right culture, and some of them were very aggressive towards mass culture, others of them had a live and let live attitude, but they still fundamentally believed that their area of cultural activity ought to continue to be supported at the level it had been.
But others saw in the new consumer society an antidote to the enclosed elite world typified by post-war institutions like the Third Programme. There'd been criticism and satire from the start about the Third Programme's esoteric, dry content.
Many people on the left couldn't care less about it and thought of it as a toppy-nosed channel. Leftist intellectuals very often thought it was a good idea, but that it had to be rescued from the assumptions so common in England, or else it would become the channel for highbrows.
Now, the station's very existence came into question. In 1953, the Express newspaper launched its Scrap the Third Programme campaign.
The Daily Express took against the Third Programme very much in the same way that popular press has taken against high culture ever since, because it felt that an enormous amount of BBC resources were being spent on a very small number of people accessing this service.
It wasn't just the Third Programme that was losing favour. The post-war demand for high art was drying up. Even subsidised theatres and orchestras began to struggle.
The money we spend on the arts is resented by some people as a needless expense and criticised by others as pitiably small. They remind us that the annual grant to the National Gallery is 1/10 of the annual pig subsidy.
The opera and the theatre on the continent are regarded as cultural necessities, whereas over here they're regarded as a luxury, and in industry is always favoured.
Critics of the Third Programme did indeed see culture as a luxury. The Oxford and Cambridge unions jointly debated the motion. This House would abolish the Third Programme.
Are honourable gentlemen opposite aware of how many listeners share my tastes in 18th century musical girondelles? The answer is 1%.
I think the Third Programme from the start did suffer from the attempt of some of the people who were producing for it to develop avant-garde tastes, which obviously couldn't even reach the minority that Haley wanted to reach.
It may be that some honourable gentleman opposite, with the maddening smugness of the intellectual warmly wrapped in his fur coat of superiority, will say that the general public can, with better education, be improved and upgraded so as to become capable of understanding these programs. But the general public does not want to be improved and upgraded. It wants to be entertained.
I suppose people who paid license money might have thought that too much was being spent on too few people, but then they did have the alternatives, didn't they?
In 1955, these alternatives expanded. The government removed the BBC's television monopoly. Commercial TV was born.
The third programme's audiences were totally unaffected by the arrival of commercial television. But the BBC's finances were badly affected.
There were people inside the BBC who began to talk about the possible sacrifice of the third programme. Within a few months of the BBC third programme celebrating its 10th anniversary, there's an inquiry into its structure and organisation, and it comes out against it.
Ian Jacob, now Director General of the BBC, announced a number of cuts to the third programme. It would have its budgets reduced and lose 50% of its airtime.
So, Ian, what are these new proposals for sound broadcasting, and why do you consider them necessary?
Well, we felt we ought to review the shape of sound broadcasting, which has remained more or less the same for 10 years, and to make certain that radio gives to the public what it requires in this television age. The third programme will retain all its normal characteristics, the flexibility, the power to extend its time, but it will be somewhat shortened as a general rule. Normally it will run from 8 till 11 p.m.
The reduction in hours would make way for a new channel, Network 3, for education and hobbies, not culture.
When they suggested replacing an hour or two of the third programme with this new thing called Network 3, which would give you instruction in woodwork and piano playing and various practical activities, the great cultural and intellectual figures absolutely went up in smoke about that, because here they were being lumped together with minority interests of a practical nature, whereas what they were interested in were great, great intellectual ideas. They were interested in Bertrand Russell and Copplestone and Jesuitical debate about the meaning of life.
The great and the good of British cultural life turned out in force to fight the cuts. They sent a delegation to the BBC, asked questions in Parliament, and published their objections.
They come from almost every conceivable kind of arts background. Acting is represented by Laurence Olivier. Michael Tippett is the representative of music, but also Vaughan Williams comes back in. In a way, towering above them is T.S. Eliot, who is emphasising the fact that the spoken word, which the BBC had done so much to bring into the world, is just as important as the written word.
Particularly galling to them was the BBC's suggestion that the audience for high culture was a minority like any other. It was a marked change from William Haley's idealism. The once strict hierarchy of highbrow and lowbrow, of high culture and popular culture, was dissolving. New poets, novelists and playwrights from working class backgrounds were challenging established taste and values.
The Royal Court Theatre opens in London, dedicated to new writing, and amazingly actually discovers a play written by a completely unknown young man called John Osborne, which articulates all the frustrations of the post-war generation.
Look Back in Anger opened in 1956 and became both a popular and a critical success. It heralded the arrival of a new sort of writing.
Well, it all came about by coincidence, and as if it had been synchronised by some beneficent or maleficent, if you like, god. There were so many people in England who didn't like to hear what they'd written, or what we'd written, if you like, and they called it rebellion, they called it angry, but it was simply, they were following the ground currents of a changing climate, I think, without even knowing they were doing it.
The arts establishment was not wholly hostile to this new climate, but those who had found favour in the years after the war sometimes found it unsettling.
I suppose there came a moment when I, for one, felt inadequate when the new movement of people from the provinces came, and there was an inverted snobbery, and I stress that against anybody like me who talked received pronunciation, and I began to regret that I hadn't been born in Liverpool or somewhere else.
The notion of culture began to change, and you felt that culture was, if you like, as it had been thought of earlier in the 19th century, that it represented, in a sense, the whole expression of a society, and not some veneer or set of tastes which were, in a way, imposed or even merely publicised. You felt that culture had an integral element in it.
The defenders of the third programme failed to stop the BBC cuts. On the eve of the changes, they held a last tribute to the old third programme. Ironically, the venue was the Royal Court Theatre, on Sunday the 29th of September, 1957.
I just knew that we had to be there. Had to be. I felt so strongly about the third programme and all that it meant to me and my husband that I was glad to take part in an evening of protest at the Royal Court Theatre when we were trying to save it, I suppose, or not to have it diminished.
Jill Balkan and C. Day Lewis read contemporary poetry. John Gielgud and Peggy Ashcroft performed Elizabethan drama. The Allegri Quartet played Mozart and McConkie. And the assembled audience heard a speech from T.S. Eliot.
For some people, a symphony orchestra may be more entertaining than a dance band. Most of us are capable of being entertained by both, but would be very sorry if we were only allowed to hear the band. The assumption behind the attitude of the BBC is alarming, because when generally unquestioned and accepted, such an assumption tends to demoralize democracy, discourage excellence, and enervate the nation.
It is the last great demonstration of high culture, uninterested in other forms of culture, assertive, powerful, but inevitably in a position which is precarious given all the changes in society.
The cultural institutions born of the 1940s had been the product of an extraordinary moment. Fleetingly, elite culture made available to all and social equality seemed to go hand in hand. Within a decade, this consensus had crumbled. The third programme itself eventually became Radio 3. But the vision that created it now belongs to a lost era.
And there's high culture and heavenly music next tonight on BBC 4 with another BBC prom. Stay tuned.
Have you ever heard of Softly Softly? Yes, I prefer set cars.
Ever suspected TV coppers had overstepped their dramatic licence?
Can't you go any faster?
Assaulting your intellect with macho stereotypes.
In my day, you used to get your bottom stamped with the CID stamp.
Well, sunshine, you're facing a stretch as BBC 4 extracts some confessions from the creators, the old Bill and those at the sharp end.
No, we can't have that. They can't have a showing British public with a piece of cookie.
There's nothing worse than a rotten copper.
Definitely not imitates life and vice versa.
I don't like it, so it's personal, it's not answered.
Britcop season continues with Call the Cops, Tuesday at 10 on BBC 4.
Tomorrow night here on BBC4, Pierre Boulez conducts works by